It was supposed to be an ordinary Saturday morning at one of Britain's most iconic landmarks. Tourists were gathering to witness the crown jewels, symbols of centuries of royal power and tradition. But what happened next would shake the entire nation and spark massive debates about activism, security, and what people are willing to do to make their voices heard. On December 6, 2025, at 9:50 in the morning, something extraordinary occurred within the Tower of London's most protected chamber. Four protesters walked into the Jewel House, the most secure section of the historic fortress, carrying something nobody expected. Not weapons, not signs, food. An entire tray of apple crumble and a container of bright yellow custard. And their target, the Imperial State Crown itself. Within seconds, a foiled tray of warm crumble smashed against the protective glass display case, splattering across its surface. Then came the custard, poured, deliberate and bold, over the front of the enclosure. Tourists stood frozen, unsure what they were witnessing. Staff members rushed to the scene, radioing for help, as the protesters revealed T-shirts reading, "Take Back Power." The message was clear, the act was deliberate, and what followed would launch investigations and ignite conversations that are still happening today. But this wasn't just some random act of vandalism. What unfolded that morning was part of a calculated strategy, connected to a larger movement and designed to send a message that couldn't be ignored. The question everyone's asking is, why? Why target the crown jewels? Why this specific symbol? And who are the people bold enough to attempt something like this? Enter Take Back Power, a relatively new organization that describes itself as a nonviolent civil resistance group. They didn't hide what they did. Instead, they filmed it, posted it online, and made sure the world knew exactly who was responsible. In their statement, they didn't apologize or backtrack. They doubled down, explaining their reasoning with statistics and demands that challenged the very foundation of how Britain operates. But before we dive into their message, we need to understand what exactly they targeted and why it matters so much.
The Imperial State Crown isn't just any piece of jewelry sitting in a museum. This crown carries the weight of British history, literally on its surface. It was originally created for the coronation of King George VI back in 1937, and it's studded with an almost incomprehensible amount of precious materials. Inside that crown are 2,868 diamonds, 17 sapphires, 11 emeralds, 4 rubies, and 269 pearls. The entire thing weighs over a kilogram. This isn't costume jewelry or a replica. This is one of the most valuable and historically significant crowns in the entire world. King Charles wore it during his coronation in 2023 and continues to wear it during state openings of Parliament. It's a symbol that reaches far beyond mere decoration. It represents the monarchy, the continuity of Britain's institutions, and centuries of tradition. That's exactly why it was chosen. The Tower of London itself is visited by more than 3 million people every single year, and a huge portion of those visitors come specifically to see the crown jewels. It's one of the main attractions, a window into royal history that draws people from across the globe. The fortress itself is over 1,000 years old, and the Jewel House, where the crown is kept, represents some of the most secure spaces in the United Kingdom. Armed guards, cameras, reinforced glass, restricted access zones, and multiple layers of security protocols all work together to protect these artifacts. Yet somehow, 4 protesters managed to get close enough to throw food at one of the world's most precious objects. That's where the real scandal begins to emerge. When Take Back Power released their footage and statement, they weren't just claiming credit for a prank. They were using it as a platform for a political message that goes to the heart of how Britain functions. According to their statement, they're demanding that the UK government create what they call a House of the People, a permanent citizens' assembly that would have real power to make decisions and implement policies. But more importantly, they want this assembly to have the authority to tax extreme wealth. And the numbers they cited? They're shocking enough to make you pause. They claimed that since 2011, the poorest 10% of British households have paid a combined tax rate of 44% on their income and wealth. Meanwhile, the richest 10%, only 22%. That's less than half. The message they're sending is that the system is broken, that the wealthy are getting away with paying proportionately less in taxes, and that ordinary working people are being squeezed from every angle.
Take Back Power spokesperson went further, arguing that both the current government and the opposition parties serve the super-rich rather than working people. They framed their protest as a desperate cry for real democracy, one where ordinary citizens have decision-making power, not just politicians. They want to shift the tax burden so that extreme wealth is actually taxed at rates comparable to what working people pay. Whether you agree with their methods or their message, what's undeniable is that they've created a moment that forces people to confront uncomfortable questions about inequality in modern Britain. But this wasn't the first time Take Back Power had made headlines. Just 5 days before the Crown Jewels incident, the very same group was behind another shocking stunt. They targeted the prestigious Ritz Hotel in London, dumping bags of manure next to its elaborate Christmas tree display. The symbolism was unmistakable. While the ultra-wealthy were celebrating luxury and excess, Take Back Power was literally bringing waste to their doorstep. The message was crude but effective. These weren't random incidents from different groups. This was a coordinated campaign, a pattern of escalation designed to draw maximum attention and force conversations that the mainstream might otherwise ignore. Within 5 days, they'd gone from dumping manure at a luxury hotel to throwing food at the Crown Jewels. The group was clearly calculating their moves, choosing targets that would generate the most media coverage and spark the biggest debates.
This escalation strategy raises important questions about how protest movements operate in the modern era. Traditional forms of activism, peaceful marches, petitions, speeches, often struggle to break through the noise of modern media. But when you do something shocking, something that breaks the status quo in a way people can't ignore, suddenly you're part of the conversation. The Crown Jewels aren't just any symbols. They represent everything that protesters like Take Back Power see as the problem. They represent monarchy, tradition, concentrated power, and wealth passing down through generations. By targeting them, they're making a statement about what they want to tear down and rebuild. Within minutes of the incident, police had responded. By around 10:30 in the morning, all 4 protesters had been taken into custody. The response was swift and decisive. The Metropolitan Police, working with City of London Police and security officers at the Tower, arrested the 4 individuals on suspicion of criminal damage. Among those arrested were a 21-year-old retail worker and a 19-year-old student. These aren't hardened criminals or career activists. They're young people who made a deliberate choice to participate in this action, understanding the legal consequences they might face. The Jewel House was temporarily closed to the public while investigators gathered evidence and assessed the situation. But here's where it gets interesting. The actual Crown Jewels weren't damaged. Historic royal palaces, the organization that manages the Tower of London, moved quickly to confirm that despite the dramatic footage of food being smashed and poured onto the display case, the Crown Jewels themselves remained unharmed. The protective glass did its job. The crown inside was safe. The custard and crumble didn't penetrate the barriers. This detail is crucial
because it changes the nature of the protest. It wasn't an attempt to destroy anything irreplaceable. It was symbolic, theatrical, and calculated to shock rather than to cause actual harm. The protesters knew the glass would protect the crown. They weren't trying to destroy a national treasure. They were trying to make a point. And they succeeded in ways they probably anticipated. The legal consequences for the four arrested individuals are still unfolding, but the charges are serious. Criminal damage is a significant offense, especially when it involves an attack on property at such a high-profile location. For the 21-year-old and 19-year-old, this could have lasting implications for their futures. Criminal records can affect employment opportunities, travel, and other aspects of their lives for years to come. They'd chosen to make a statement, and now they're facing the costs of that choice in the courts and in their personal lives. Whether they regret the decision or view it as a necessary sacrifice for the cause remains to be seen.
The incident sparked immediate reactions from political figures and officials. Crime and Policing Minister Sarah Jones described the action as disgraceful, reflecting the government's strong disapproval. There was no sympathy, no acknowledgement of the underlying issues the protesters were trying to highlight, just condemnation. This is typical of how protests that challenge the system are often met with dismissal rather than engagement. Instead of discussing the wealth inequality statistics that Take Back Power cited, instead of debating the merits of a citizens' assembly with real power, the focus shifted to law and order. A protest that wanted to talk about systemic inequality found itself reduced to a story about vandalism. Security experts and observers immediately began raising questions about how this happened. How did four protesters get close enough to the crown jewels to throw food at the display? What does this say about the security at one of Britain's most important landmarks? The Tower of London has extensive security measures in place. It's supposed to be one of the most protected sites in the country. Yet somehow this breach occurred. Some observers speculated about security lapses. Others suggested that the protesters had simply chosen a moment when guards were momentarily inattentive or when the timing worked in their favor. The incident sparked a broader conversation about how to maintain security while keeping historic sites open to the public. The tower hosts millions of visitors annually. Making it a fortress would destroy its appeal as a tourist destination, but allowing millions of people through its doors creates obvious vulnerabilities.
The public reaction was deeply divided, as is often the case with bold protest actions. Some people saw Take Back Power as heroes, willing to risk legal consequences to draw attention to real problems in British society. They pointed to the wealth inequality statistics and asked why the government wasn't doing more to address these issues. If peaceful methods hadn't worked, if traditional activism had been ignored, wasn't it time for something bolder? Others saw the protest as an attack on British heritage and tradition. The crown jewels represent centuries of history, continuity, and cultural pride. Throwing food at them was disrespectful, childish, and criminal. The fact that they didn't actually damage anything was irrelevant. The intention and the symbolism were what mattered. Between these two camps, there was very little middle ground. The incident had become a Rorschach test. What you thought about it revealed a lot about what you thought about wealth inequality, activism, tradition, and the proper role of government. Media coverage varied wildly depending on the outlet. Some sources focused heavily on the criminal aspect, leading with "protesters arrested" as the headline. Others emphasized the political message, giving more airtime to Take Back Power statements about wealth inequality. International media picked up the story too, framing it through different lenses depending on their audience. In some countries, it was presented as an example of radical activism going too far. In others, it was covered as a sign that ordinary people were waking up to systemic inequality.
The same incident could be spun in completely different directions depending on who was telling the story. This raises a critical question about whether stunts like this actually work. Take Back Power certainly succeeded in getting media attention. The Crown Jewels incident generated headlines around the world. But did it change anything? Has it made the government more likely to establish a citizens' assembly with real power to tax extreme wealth? Has it shifted public opinion on wealth inequality? Has it inspired others to join the cause? Or has it simply hardened the positions of those already opposed? The answers to these questions will take time to become clear. Activism is often more effective in hindsight than it appears in the moment. Some of history's most important movements seemed like failures when they were happening, only to be recognized as turning points years later.
Take Back Power isn't the only protest group making headlines in Britain. In recent years, organizations like Just Stop Oil have used similar tactics: disruption, dramatic imagery, and willingness to face legal consequences to draw attention to environmental issues. The pattern is becoming recognizable. Traditional activism feels like it's struggling to get traction. Electoral politics feels captured by wealthy interests, so more groups are turning to civil disobedience, to acts that are designed to disrupt, to shock, to make it impossible to look away. Whether this strategy ultimately serves their causes or simply alienates potential supporters is a question that activists and observers continue to debate. The Tower of London has continued operating since the incident. The Jewel House reopened to the public after investigations were completed. Millions of people continue to come see the crown jewels each year. Life goes on, and in many ways, it's as if the incident barely happened. Yet, something did shift. The question of wealth inequality, the demands for real citizen participation in democracy, the frustration with a system that seems rigged toward the wealthy, these things are still being discussed. Take Back Power is still out there. Their website went viral after the incident, drawing new attention to their cause and their demands. Whether you sympathize with them or condemn them, they've succeeded in injecting their message into the conversation. That's what activism ultimately is, an attempt to change the conversation, to make people think differently about the world around them, to force a reckoning with uncomfortable truths. Looking at the broader context, what happened at the Tower of London on December 6th wasn't really about apple crumble and custard. It was about fundamental questions of power, wealth, and who gets to decide how society operates. The crown jewels are symbols of monarchical power and national continuity. Take Back Power threw food at those symbols because they want to challenge who has power in Britain and how that power is distributed. They want ordinary people to have more say in decisions that affect their lives. They want the wealthy to contribute proportionally more to the tax system. Whether you agree with their methods, their goals, or their statistics, they've forced a confrontation with these questions. The 4 people arrested that morning made a choice to become part of a larger movement. They understood the risks they were taking. They knew that throwing food at the crown jewels would result in criminal charges. They did it anyway, believing that the message was worth the personal cost. In a society where peaceful activism can feel ineffectual and where traditional political channels seem closed off, people are increasingly willing to take dramatic action. The question that Britain and the world now faces is whether societies can address the underlying grievances that drive people to acts like this, or whether we'll continue to see more shocking disruptions as people become more desperate to be heard.
The crown jewels sit safely behind their protective glass, protected, preserved, and on display for millions to see each year. The 4 protesters are facing serious charges. Take Back Power continues to plan their next actions, their next targets, their next message. And Britain continues to grapple with questions about wealth, equality, activism, and how citizens should be able to participate in the decisions that affect their lives. The apple crumble and custard have been cleaned up, the display case has been restored, but the conversation that took place on that December morning is far from over. In many ways, it's only just beginning. This is a moment that reveals deep fissures in how we think about protest, power, and justice in the modern world, and whether we can build systems that actually listen to people before they feel compelled to take such dramatic action.